I said, you can't make everyone happy.
No, but these are an interesting group of people because I was online and there's already a group of people that don't really leave their niche wouldn't really know this, but let's just say that you jumped over with me. Well, guess what? There's vegan versus carnivore. They attack each other in a very similar manner, right? So they the paleo people who want to barbecue every meal, they hate the vegans who say don't you choke to death on your chicken wing, and then they hate each other, so their death threats are going in. And then you don't even see that unless you're part of that. And then you jump over to this creation versus evolution. It's the same war. We're trying to show them.
The flat earthers and the globe earthers, like the comments under their videos are still just the same collection of hate. And I'm all like,
yeah.
Why are you guys being hateful? Like, how about just talk about the relevant facts? Why? Like, it would never occur to me to be like, I don't believe the earth is flat. I'm going to go to their channel and call them names. Like, why?
No, yeah. Yeah, the amount of time
about the shape of the earth, so what? Like, how are you going to be offended by that?
Yes, yeah. There's one that's particularly funny. You might even know this because he's been an anti-creationist for a long time. I see the name even going back in videos over 5 years ago. His name is Gary Walker. And I noticed is a black guy that's wearing all red. Anyway, but basically, like, I've seen his comments, and he goes on tirades, right? And I go back 5, 6, 7 years, and it's still the same tirade over and over and over. And I'm thinking to myself, can you imagine the amount of knowledge that he could have learned if he wasn't just constantly trolling? He could have like 2 degrees. He would actually understand what he's arguing against. Because if you ask him questions, he doesn't even know what he's arguing against. He doesn't even know what an allele is. So it's quite funny, really, that they have
They never know what they're arguing for. I have convinced myself by talking to atheists and evolutionists that none of them understand what evolution is. Like, every time I ask them, what do you think it is? Like, seriously, last week I had this debate, and I said, define for me what you mean by evolution. And he said, the passing of alleles from one generation to the next, or something like that. And I was like, wait a minute, you've just described reproduction. That's it? That's your entire, that's all you're talking about?
Right.
And like, yeah, like, he didn't argue. He didn't be like, no, that's not what I mean. I'm like, he was just like, well, there's all these different, like, it happens, and then there's natural selection. I'm like, okay, but your definition of evolution, when you're talking about it, all you mean is reproduction. I'm like, so every time a chicken lays an egg or a bacteria splits in two, you say evolution has happened. Well, no wonder you think it's observable, because you have no idea what you're talking about.
Yeah. And I love this one too. This one's great. They go, you bring up something to debunk evolution. You go, did you know that, here's just an example. We'll go to the stars real quick, and we'll talk about how many supernovas we see in the universe, and they'll go, that has nothing to do with evolution. Evolution is only biology. I go, oh, well, excuse me. Okay, so what's your best example of evolution then? They take you right to the fossil record. Wait, you just said it has to do with biology. Now you're taking me to your fossil record. There's no biology in this.
Paleontology, biology, isn't that kind of the same thing? Except
it must be. It was identical.
Oh, no, this dude, I have to download the video and just put up little clips, but I was just astounded. He told me that the laws of thermodynamics do not affect DNA because the Earth is not a closed system. Like, he was trying to debunk the idea that we have, acquiring mutations that what do you call it? Genetic entropy. He was like, that's right. Debunked because the second law of thermodynamics doesn't apply to an open system. I'm like, you're telling me the laws of physics don't apply to DNA because reasons. We're just going to hand wave away the laws of physics. and then he also told me, near the end of the debate, he told me that when fish evolved into lizards, they didn't have to gain the genes for legs and lungs and other lizard parts. They already had them. They just weren't activated yet.
Wow. Really? So those are dormant genes. All of them are turned off.
Right? I'm like, did the worms have them too? Like, did the first bacteria just have the genes for everything on Earth, and now they've just been randomly switched on? Like,
right. Let's see. Let's deduce that real quick. Okay, the average bacteria has about 1,225 to 1,500 genes. The average human has about 19,000. They're still debating about 19,000 to 2,000 or 20,000. A water flea has about 37,000 genes. So now we have a bacteria which is guaranteed to have just about 1,000 at best. And then a human, 19,000. Where did those come from? According to him, these are just hidden.
They're
already there, just hidden, blank. Great. Wow. Okay. Interesting. But you're wrong.
one of the questions, like, so I'm bringing up genetics and cellular biology and the things we know, and at the end, one of the questions from the peanut gallery is, how come you didn't you didn't appeal at all to modern science? I'm like, what? Okay, I made reference to Charles Darwin, but I think modern genetics is modern enough science to apply. Like, how much more new do you need to be? And there was no answer to that, but I'm like, if you guys aren't going to listen while I talk, I can just go. I wrote a book based on a bunch of articles I had written called Thursday Night Nachos, the Defining Evolution series. And in there, I explained that evolution has to explain where new genes come from, because the example I give is fish don't have the genes for legs and lungs and the things that make fish different from lizards. Because you either have to believe fish always had those genes or that they gained them somehow to become lizards. But I make this distinction in the book just to explain why evolution has to explain that gain. It never occurred to me somebody would be so completely ignorant as to think that fish did have all of the lizard genes. So when he said that, I'm sure, I haven't watched it, but I'm sure that this is what people see. I didn't know what to say. I'm like, I did not assume that somebody would really be dumb enough to believe that or to assert that. I simply put it forward as an idea to make sure we understood why, just to clarify. But he actually said that to me on camera, and I no longer believe that any evolutionist knows what evolution is. They just don't.
That's awesome. Man, you'll love this. So we had a guy that builds phylogenetic trees. He builds these phylogeny trees, and he built one on lizards and snakes, right? I believe snakes. So he actually told us that legs aren't necessary. They're one of the first things that are selected away. So now you got a fish that needs legs, but he's telling you, no, legs aren't required at all. Matter of fact, it's the first thing to get rid of them. That's why snakes got rid of their legs, because they weren't necessary. So that's exactly the opposite of what you're saying. Their theory needs their fish to go on land. They require these genes for legs. So why would they evolve the genes that they don't need? That the selection would be the first thing to get rid of. See, the circular reasoning doesn't even make sense.
I don't even know if there's enough reasoning to be circular.
It's just pretty crazy. They don't even realize how much their theory's already been falsified. Darwin's single tree of life has already been falsified. We know that now it's a 3-tiered domain of life. Like, that's what they believe now. So that single Darwinian rooted ancestor that all life came from, they don't even believe that anymore. Now it's the 3-tiered system bush of life, they call it. So that's already falsified Darwinism. So that's gone. And then in the 1960, Ernest Mayr came along and said that if we find any life that has the similar genes with each other, that'll disprove evolution entirely. You know why? Because evolution is so true and has occurred over such a long, vast amount of time that there's no way we should share any genetic information with each other. Well, guess what? They looked in there and they found we share genes with almost everything. So they hid that. That's gone because that falsified their theory immediately. Now they use it as their best evidence for evolution. The very argument that disproved them is now their favorite argument for it.
Yeah.
Ironic. I tell you, man, the shadiness behind it is just crazy. Matter of fact, that gets into what I posted on your channel. When I talk about when we go inside and we look at the human genome, we want to learn how old something is. So the best way of doing that is by looking at substitutions and mutation rates. So meaning, you know of one, you just mentioned mutation rates. Every generation, we accumulate more mutations that selection cannot see, and they build up in the human body. The average is about 63, they found, and that's with Nordic people up in Denmark, Norway, and Sweden. You get around Africa, Nathaniel Jensen said it's going to be about twice that much because they have generation times that are faster. So the accumulation will be even more. But in general, worldwide, it seems to be about 100 to 200 new mutations per generation, and it's constantly building up. And they're always building up, and selection can't get rid of them. So let's say from the beginning, there was Adam. He had no mutations. The next generation, let's say there was 80 was the average amount of mutations passed on. Well, then the next generation after that, 80 would be 160, and then 200. So it would go on, and it would accumulate. And that's where we're getting this mutational load. It's accumulating every generation. That's how we're able to test, going back, how many new mutations there are. And then what we do is we test what are called trio studies. They're the most accurate in the world. And another name for them are called pedigree studies. So what we do is we take two parents and then a child, and we look at the child and say, how many more new mutations do they have than the parents? So then they extrapolate back, and they go back until they go to 0, and they find, This is about 6,000 years ago on average. The first study that was ever done was done on substitutions. It wasn't necessarily looking at the mutations because substitutions are much easier to count. Basically, what a substitution rate is a substitution occurs when you're looking at the chain of the DNA. You're going to see the alleles when they switch over. And that's like a point mutation. So they happen once every 33 generations. Evolutionists assumed if evolution is true, you're only going to find one substitution every 300 to 600 generations, right? So that would account for the long ages and why they predict that there was a bottleneck about 200,000 years ago. That's their assumption anyway. That's when primitive man went in and modern day man came out. Yeah, that one, that model. So basically they said, okay, well, if substitution rates are correct, then we should only find one substitution every 300 to 600 generations. So then they started testing and doing these trio studies. And then they found, there's only one every 33. So that placed man around 6,100 to 6,500 years ago. That was Hal in 1996. And so he was like, wow, that's incredible. So he wanted to do a bigger study on that. So he went and he started going back to the drawing board to gather more people. He wanted to see if this was true because obviously this discounted evolutionary theory entirely. Because before that, what they had done is they just assumed evolution was already true. So what they did is they built their charts based on what's called phylogeny. They didn't look at trios. They didn't do these studies. They only built in the common ancestor split from humans about 6.5 million years ago, and they added it to the math for everything that ever came out. And they still do it today. If you go into Google and you type in phylogeny methods, you'll find Google and Wikipedia take you directly to that answer. That's how they build their charts. So we come along now and we're like, okay, well, what's the next one? So a creationist by the name of Parsons came out and he wanted to do another one. So he looked at soldiers, I think 221 different random soldiers, families. And so he started looking at their substitution rate. And so this is the biggest study that was ever done. And so he was like, oh my gosh, this is incredible. He studied and looked at the substitution rates and he gathered that there was between 25 to 40 substitutions. That maximum. He goes, oh, that's incredible. This places man exactly 6,500 years ago. He said, I'm going to double the amount of people in the study. So he doubled it. And the exact same rate occurred, exactly the same. So he published it and the FBI picked it up. And the forensic analysis system that studies and chases killers today use his method. So nobody can say it's inaccurate. Nobody can come along and say, well, you guys use some things that is that's just Funan. You're trying to prove creation because he was a creationist, right? So they didn't like his numbers. Matter of fact, a guy named Stone King came out the next year and tried to disprove him. So he was already doing phylogeny studies. So he wanted to do a trio study himself to disprove it. So he went out to an island and he found a little tiny island where people had lived on it. I think it's only 79 square miles. It's one of the smallest islands on Earth in that region. And he found a family that had died and all been buried in one area. And they were, and so he studied their mutations and he goes, look at that. They don't even have any mutations to count for. So there's 0 mutations in the family. You can discount all the trio studies that you guys have ever done. And so what he did, this is why it's so shady. So he took a highly inbred family that had highly deleterious mutations rate to the point where they all died from their mutations. They got so highly inbred. Well, when you get high deleterious mutations that are building up, selection tries to get rid of them. And it does. It gets rid of the mutations so they're not handed down to the next generation. And then so what happens is that kid gets this new deformed mutation and then selection gets rid of it. So it might not be handed down to the next generation. So he hands down this new deformity and then boom, selection gets rid of it. And then there's another, the genetics keep going downhill. So he selected a particular family that would show no mutations so that he could try to invalidate it. See what I mean? Shady. So it didn't work. Parsons came out and said, this is why you got that rate, and this is why you're deceptively showing it to the public. So then another evolutionist came along and said, let's use both methods worldwide and see what happens. So Ann Gibbons came along in 1998, and she did worldwide populations, and she did a pedigree study going back multiple generations from everywhere in the world. And hers actually completely agreed with Parsons' study, but it even lowered it because she got anywhere between 22 to 38 substitutions. And she also counted mutation rates. So she looked at the mutations accumulation and found that, again, she looked at about the 63 to 100 mark and calculated it back, and it went back to exactly 6,000 years. So again, we have observable rates And then we look around the world at all the pedigree studies that were done, because I'm talking about just humans. They actually have done this now on fruit flies. They've done it on worms. They've done it on chickens, and they've done it on wolves. They've done it on a few animals now. Every single time, the mutation rate is very, very young, and it goes back to a very young branching pattern. So what they did is they had to invoke, well, maybe a bottleneck happened. I say a bottleneck 6,000 years ago to wipe out all people on Earth. Think about that for just a minute. Where in the world is that in your model? Nowhere. You can't even find a bottleneck in your own fossil record going back 200,000 years ago that you say happened. Now you expect us to believe that there was one 6,000 years ago that wiped all humanity away except for one woman that was able to bear all the human beings that are alive on Earth today. That's what we're seeing, right? Because that's what they say. This is just going back to a common ancestor. That doesn't mean it's the first human. Okay, then explain why 6,000 years ago there was one woman that birthed all of humanity. Because that's what the evidence shows. And I just showed you Parsons, I showed you Howells and Gibbons. There's also a Holland study that was done in 1999. There was Tamir's that was done in 2002. There was Rhodes that was done in 2004. Every time they do a pedigree study and they don't incorporate phylogeny method, which incorporates the missing link common ancestor 6.5 million years ago, they get exactly the same answer every single time. So they've invoked multiple rescue devices for this, as you would imagine. They can't have this. So one of them was used in a debate against Standing for Truth. It was that, well, the mutation rates were probably different in the past. This was used by Augusta Gibbons. She said that. Well, it must have been different. That's obvious. And then a guy named Dan, he came along and said, no, it was constant, but it only goes back to the most recent common ancestor. It doesn't prove that it was the first human being. So, you know what I mean? Those are their two best arguments. They have another one, but it's just even more wacko. Not even worth saying. So, you know what I mean? They each have their own rescuing devices, but there's literally no answer for them for these observable rates. That's why they invoke phylogeny, because the observable rate completely contradicts what they need to be true. And that's hands down. It's really looking bad for them. And then, yeah, I went on too much. Go ahead.
No. This is the kind of thing that I wanted my audience to hear, because the comments I get all the time, even from Christian evolutionists, is they try to explain to me how science works. I all the time they're like, the way that science works is that we look at the data, and if it conflicts with our standing beliefs, then we change our beliefs to match it. I'm like, if that were true, nobody would be an evolutionist anymore. But
Right.
what you find when you actually look at examples are, oh, the observable data seems to point to the Bible, so rescue device, evolution still stands as long as we throw these patches on and kind of ignore what we actually saw and reinterpret what we saw. So
Yeah, so yeah, another big problem as well is you got to remember that a lot of these people are writing in peer-reviewed journals, meaning they want more grant money. They want to earn something from this. It's their job, their livelihood. They probably work in the field. So when you go to the bottom and you read their conclusion, they're not going to say this proves a model of young Earth creation. Of course not. So they're always like, well, what does the paper agree with? Well, it agrees with what their belief system is, first of all, because it's going to agree with what they need to, because their jobs are going to be in trouble. Like Mary Schweitzer, for example, when she found dinosaur soft tissue, I uploaded a video on my channel where she goes, I was in fear for my job. I knew it was almost over. And then what happened is she watched her colleague get fired for saying that this soft dinosaur tissue must be young. So what do you think she would say? You think she's going to come and say the same thing and get fired? Of course not. Of course she's going to say, I believe in evolution. You'd have to be an idiot to watch your colleague say, I got fired, or just watch him get fired, and then to say the same thing as him. Literally. I mean, come on, people, read between the lines. Stop being so critically biased for evolution and thinking about like, oh, well, the scientists agree with evolution. Really?
well, the opinion that you get is that in order for us to say, well, the scientists are lying about it, is we're saying that scientists are dishonest people and you can't trust them. Like they sort of swing that pendulum to the sort of conspiracy mode that scientists are all a bunch of liars who know that evolution's false and they're all in on it together. Like it's not a matter of saying that all scientists are liars. It's a matter of saying that all scientists went to public school, they were told this, and they've never heard an answer to the contrary, and they're not allowed to question it. Much like,
Right.
The Quran in Saudi Arabia, you might have questions, but if anyone else finds out you have questions, you're in trouble. So you keep those to yourself. And so it seems like you're the only one who has questions because no one else is saying, I have doubts about this. And so it seems like, well, everybody knows this is a fact. So if you have those doubts, you have external pressure not to say them out loud, and you have no external support to say other people have these doubts too. Like, it's not a matter of calling science dishonest. It's a matter of saying, all right, the observable facts don't fit the model, but you're not allowed to question the model.
Right, exactly. I have a lot of trouble with myself because I coach people for fighting. And if I get somebody who's a wrestler and I'm starting to coach them, it's actually very hard for me. And the reason why is because in jiu-jitsu, you have to fight off your back. In judo, you fight off your back. As brief as it may be that you want it, regardless, you learn to fight off your back to be comfortable because there are some people on this earth you're never going to take down. So we learn to fight defensively off of our back. It's very hard to untrain them. Very hard. Once they're indoctrinated, after 5 years, I'm still watching that same mistake where they turn over to give their back. And I'm like, what are you doing? It's like, it's ingrained into them. I can't untrain them. I'm better off with somebody that's never trained before because they're an open book. I can fill in the pages with the best habits possible. But if they already come in with this preconceived notion that I never should fall to my back, I have to untrain them, and it's almost impossible. That's where we get that term indoctrination from. Little do we know, we were all indoctrinated. Well, the vast majority of us, we go to school and we only learn evolution. So when we're looking at these studies, we're like, why does this show 6,000 years? Like I myself did. I go, let's see what the answer is for this. And then you read and you're like, that doesn't even make any sense. So what other answers are there? And they just don't give any. I actually just finished a book written called The Evolutionary Rescue Device. And in it is every rescue device they give for everything that exists. I wanted to keep going with it, but it became redundant. Like, why do insects have sonar, the ability to hear sonar from bats? They say, well, it's because bats eat them, so they evolve sonar. It makes sense, right? I mean, it makes logical sense that they would evolve that if they're being eaten. Well, guess what? They go down on the fossil record and they found that moth and insects and grasshoppers already had the hearing before supposedly bats evolved it. So what is the evolutionary rescue device? Well, the insects knew that bats would one day evolve this, so they started it earlier. Are you kidding me? That is insane. I wish people could see it because it literally borders on the insanity. So when you start telling people this, because they really, like you said, they don't know what their own theory actually teaches. You have to read the fine print. You have to go into detail. Yeah. And when you actually start to see what all these different theories say and the rescue devices, they're really, really bad. I mean, for example, the women, right? How many women were there at the same time as there's this mythical Eve to the evolutionist? Well, according to their evolutionary theory, 200,000 years ago, there were about 9,999 other women that were alive randomly in the world. So that means 9,999 women either only gave birth to boys, two, left descendants that all died. Every single one of their branches, their lineages died, or three, they were infertile. You know what I mean? There really aren't too many options. So they didn't leave any evidence that they've ever existed. They all died or they all gave birth to boys, and that only one female birthed a girl that left every lineage of humans that we have today, 200,000 years ago, in a fossil record where there's no evidence of a bottleneck, according to their own theory. What? That's what. Go ahead, look it up, guys. The numbers exist. Just type in 200,000 years ago. How many humans existed? They'll say 30,000. Okay, well, if there's 30,000, how many is half that? Well, that would be women, right? So I even gave the benefit of the doubt and said, let's just say there were 10,000 women. Okay, there's 10,000 women that only one gave birth to a girl. That exactly when we say the earth formed and God created humanity. Like, what are the odds of that? Like, you know how easy it is to falsify young earth creation? It's easy. We're stuck with what the Bible says in the timeline and the time frame that it says. You can easily disprove it, but when the evidence keeps showing up, that's true. It's not looking good, guys.